welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Now, Europe is in the process of decoupling from Russian gas, and new proposals are stirring the plot. The European Parliament's Energy Committee just backed a move to speed up the REPowerEU timeline. Meanwhile, President Zelensky's Washington visit has been closely watched as Kyiv is exploring leasing its gas transit network to United States firm to supply Slovakia and Hungary. Joining us today on TVP World to unpack this is Tomasz Włostowski, managing partner at EU Strategies, a veteran in EU energy and geopolitics, whose analysis combine policy insight with real-world stakes. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thanks for having me.
So we just saw the EP Energy Committee proving a stronger timeline in cutting Russian energy. But my question is the timeline realistic, and do you think it's enforceable within all the different EU countries?
Well, it has to be, right? I mean, once we adopt it, we will have to enforce it. We'll see what comes out at the end of the trialogue. Let's keep in mind we have the position of the Parliament just adopted yesterday, as you pointed out. On Monday, we have the EU member states meet in the Transport and Energy Council. We'll see if they... Currently, in their version, we have the final deadline of 2020, end of 27, so the 1st of January 28. In the Parliament's version is already end of 26, so the 1st of January 27. So there's 1 year of a difference between the two institutions. We'll see if the member states fight for the longer deadline or not. But Europe is ready to get rid of Russian gas and of Russian oil. Of course, member states have their own sort of peculiar interests. So on the one hand, they have their sort of importers have contracts, the firms have contracts, the terminals have contracts. So the member states are worried whether they will be able to get rid of those contracts legally. That's why they want a longer timeline. They would like also to prepare their own institutions for getting rid of Russian gas. That's why they want a longer timeline. Mm-hmm. But the Parliament has been quite strict from the very beginning, actually, of the war. And we expect the rapporteurs from the Parliament to fight very hard to keep the deadline of the 1st of January 27. So we'll see.
Right. So from a legal and political standpoint, talking about the countries and member states that still wanted to do business with Russia, so reliant on Russian energy, do you think there'll be some back and forth and eventually establishing or landing on a timeline that is perhaps a little bit later than the initial proposal?
Well, look, I think, 2 points. There's, of course, we have some member states that, they want to continue buying or maybe even trading in Russian energy. So we have that, of course, and that's, Hungary and Slovakia, of course, they want to continue buying Russian energy, but we have also some member states that are buying, they're importing a lot of LNG, and they're mainly worried maybe not about sort of buying it, but they are worried about the contractual liability of the firms they have, and they've been fighting very hard to keep the package as strong legally as possible to make sure that their firms can invoke the force majeure clause, which would allow them to get out of these contracts. So those are sort of the two reasons. But let's keep in mind we have a number of issues that are outstanding between the member states and the Parliament. So the first one is the deadline, as you pointed out. Normally, what happens in Brussels is you break it halfway. So basically, if the Parliament says the 1st of January 27, if member states say the 1st of January 28, normally you meet yourselves halfway. But we'll see what happens in this case. But let's keep in mind there are other issues at stake as well. The Parliament also added a ban on importation of oil, of petroleum products, also of petroleum products from Russian oil imported from third countries. So the Parliament has really expanded the scope of this legislation and the ban on importation of Russian energy. So that's number 2. Number 3, the Parliament also expanded the ban on providing terminal services for Russian gas. The Council completely rejected it, doesn't want it in. Mm-hmm. So that's the 3rd point. The 4th point is the legal basis. The member states are really afraid of this legislation being interpreted as sanctions, so they're worried about what the legal basis would be. So basically, we have a number of issues that are at stake, and as usual in negotiations, you can trade off one issue against the other. So we'll see how this ultimately comes out.
Now, there's also a theory that a lot of countries, well, perhaps a few countries, are hoping to get back to business as usual with Russia if the war is actually over. Do you think that if the war is to end before the deadline, some of these kind of stricter deadlines will actually fall flat and the countries will go back into trading with Russia? Or do you think that this decoupling of Russian energy will just be a permanent mainstay?
Well, Ben, this is the crux. You've hit the crux, the nail on the head. This is the $1 million question. Until now, if you're a Russian exporter, until now, you were not particularly worried about the situation because, okay, there's a war, EU has sanctions, they have sanctions against our energy, but we sort of assume that for now they're not buying our energy, but when the war is over, we'll come back to business as usual, as you point out. This is why this legislation is really the key, and it's incredibly, incredibly important, because once this legislation gets adopted, there's really no way back for Russian energy into Europe unless the Commission proposes changes. Majority of member states support bringing Russian energy into Europe, and majority of the European Parliament supports that. So if you think about how strong of a majority you would have to bring and put together to bring Russian energy back, if this legislation gets adopted and enters into force, as far as I'm concerned, Russian energy is gone from Europe probably forever, because it's going to be very difficult to build the majorities to completely undo this. And this is why I think we'll see more and more ideas to try to derail this process at the very last minute.
All right, very interesting. Thank you for helping us unpack that. Now, I'm also trying to focus on Zelensky's Washington visit as he proposed using Ukraine's gas transit for some of the U.S. firms. How plausible do you think that idea is, leasing Ukraine's gas transit system to U.S. companies to supply Central Europe?
Well, the main problem with this idea is, of course, that it runs completely against what the EU is doing, right? As we just discussed, Europe wants to completely ban Russian energy from coming into Europe. This is what we just voted on yesterday. Right. So now Zelensky comes with this proposal, leasing Ukrainian infrastructure. But what will be passing through that infrastructure? Well, that's going to be Russian gas, right? Passing through. So, that proposal is completely against, I think, what the EU is doing. But, we have to understand Zelensky, right? He is basically his main and number one objective, and there's no other objective he has, but his main objective is to get President Trump on his good side. He understands that President Trump wants he's a deal maker. He wants to make deals. And this issue of somehow putting Americans between Europe and Russia and having American firms trading in Russian energy, bringing it to Europe, that has been thrown around already quite a number of times. So Zelensky, I think, spotted an ideal sort of point where he can come in, show to President Trump that he's a deal maker, just like Trump. He's ready to negotiate, because as far as Zelensky is concerned, the number one objective is to keep Trump on his good side, even if that means going completely against what Europe is doing at the moment.
So where do you think, or red lines should the EU and member states watch if such a model or this proposal continues to go forward in the negotiation phase?
Well, look, number one is, Ben, I don't think this is a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that the summit between Trump and Putin just got announced, and at the same time, Europe's moving away and banning completely Russian energy. This is not a coincidence. And it's also not a coincidence that Zelensky came with this proposal, because really it's now or never. So to answer your question, we have to see what happens on Monday when the member states meet. But if member states approve what's called a general approach in Europe, in sort of Brussels jargon, basically, if they approve what's currently on the table, and there is a permanent sort of ban of Russian energy, especially of gas in Europe, then I find it really difficult to understand how Zelensky's proposals can come to fruition. It will basically be irrelevant, because we would have already gone severely into banning Russian energy in Europe, and the pipeline is going to be useless.
Right. Now, so we, of course, like you mentioned, have to wait until some of these results of the summit come out. But in the meantime, I'm also curious about the strikes of Russia and Ukraine on each other's energy infrastructure, and that how much has that impacted the balance of energy within the region so far?
Well, of course, it has a massive impact on what's happening in Russia, right? Mm-hmm. And this goes back to this idea that the West basically 2 years ago made a strategic decision to allow Russian energy exports to the world. Like, we could have banned them, but we basically decided that it's okay. Well, we're not going to be buying Russian energy, but if others do it, it's okay, and it's okay for our firms to help Russians export that energy. What Ukrainians are doing by striking Russian infrastructure, they basically basically imposing a permanent export ban on Russian energy. That's what they're doing, because it's going to be physically almost impossible to export that energy if the infrastructure is struck. The Russians, refineries that are getting attacked, the amount of the produce that they can put on the market is decreasing, so they need to supply their own market, and now they're even importing products back into Russia because they're having difficulty supplying their own market. So this has a massive implication, maybe not on the region, basically Europe, but it has a massive impact on how much money Russia can get from selling their energy abroad and to finance the war.
All right, going back to the timing you just mentioned, like I said, Trump met Zelensky and he's going to be talking to Putin real soon. Do you think that this move by Zelensky is also something to kind of give himself a little bit of leverage, a little bit better on Trump's side going into this negotiation, and maybe he'll drop the idea afterwards? Or do you think that this is something that he's actually trying to pursue, and we're seeing a Zelensky that is now leaning more towards pleasing the pleasing the U.S. administration as opposed to keeping aligned with his European allies?
Well, look, it's quite difficult because there's a couple of issues that are sort of playing out, a couple of plates that are up in the air, right? Basically, I think Zelensky is very concerned about the upcoming meeting between Putin and Trump. So I think that's what he's really concerned about, and he wants to show as much as possible to Trump that he's a deal maker and he wants to get Trump on his good side. So I think that's number one. That's Zelensky's number one objective. At the same time, we have this legislative process that's happening in Europe, and this process is going to get wrapped up basically probably by end of October, maybe somewhere into November, but it's going to be done. So on Monday, we have the member states adopt their position, and then the negotiations start between the parliament and the member states. Once they agree a deal and the legislation is finalized, there's literally no way for this Russian energy to come back to the European market. So whatever Trump and Zelensky agree between themselves is going to be very difficult to bring it to make it come alive, especially to Europe.
All right, it's another showcase of how tightly energy and geopolitics intertwine. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. For more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.